She did not scream when they tied her wrists. She bit down on the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, pressed one hand flat against the curve of her belly, and she did not scream, because screaming meant surrender. And Grace Whitaker had made her daughter a promise before either of them had drawn a single breath of Montana summer air that no man, not one living soul on this scorched and indifferent earth, would ever make them small enough to disappear. Her brother had just sold her, and the rope around her wrists still smelled like his barn. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you stay right here. Subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that summer road and find out how a pregnant girl with bound wrists and a broken heart became the woman who brought down Silas Crowe. The morning Grace Whitaker understood that love could be a transaction started the way all the worst mornings do, quietly without warning, wrapped in the ordinary sounds of a household waking up. She had been awake since before the sun cleared the ridge. That was nothing new. Sleep had been a stranger to her for the better part of 2 months, ever since the baby dropped low and heavy and made every position feel like punishment. She lay on her side on the narrow cot in Samuel's spare room, one hand resting on her belly, feeling the small, firm kicks that had become the only rhythm she trusted anymore. The baby moved like she was already impatient, like she already knew the world outside was taking too long to be ready for her. "Settle down, Anna," Grace whispered. She had been calling her Anna in secret. Samuel didn't know. Nobody knew. A name felt like the one thing she could give that nobody could take away yet. The baby kicked again hard against Grace's ribs, and Grace pressed back gently with 2 fingers. "I hear you. I'm thinking." She had been thinking for weeks. Thinking about the letter that came from the land office. Thinking about the way Samuel had gone quiet after he read it, not the quiet of a man absorbing bad news, but the quiet of a man who already knew what the letter said and was simply waiting for someone else to find out. Thinking about the name she'd overheard. Silas Crowe, Barrett and Associates. Thinking about the figure scratched in pencil on the back of an envelope she found tucked inside Samuel's Bible. A number large enough to make her stomach drop, even without knowing what it meant. She had been thinking. But she had not moved fast enough. The boots on the kitchen floorboards were not Samuel's. She knew his step, the uneven rhythm of it, the way his left heel dragged slightly after the fall he took 3 winters back. These boots were heavier, more deliberate. 2 pairs, maybe 3. Men who were trying to walk quietly and failing because they were too big and too sure of themselves to manage it. Grace sat up. Her body protested. Her back locked, her hips ached, and the baby shifted with a rolling lurch that made her exhale sharply through her teeth. She got her feet to the floor and pressed her palms flat against the mattress and pushed herself upright, and then she stood in the thin gray light of the spare room and listened. Samuel's voice, low, fast. Another voice she did not recognize, flat and unhurried, the way a man speaks when he does not expect to be argued with. She in the back room. A pause. Then Samuel again, even quieter. "She's sleeping." "Don't much matter." Grace moved to the door. She did not open it. She pressed her ear against the wood and breathed through her nose and kept her hand on her belly and listened with every part of herself that was still capable of being surprised. "Contract's drawn," the flat voice said. "You put your name to it last week. Crowe don't wait on a signature twice." "I know that," Samuel said. She's near her time. Another few weeks and she'll—" "That ain't Crowe's concern. She's my sister." There was a sound, not a laugh exactly, more like the memory of one. "Then you should have thought on that before you signed." Grace stopped breathing. The room around her went very still, the way a room does when the mind goes suddenly utterly clear of everything except the single fact it is trying to refuse. She heard it. She understood it. She stood in the thin gray light with her hand on her unborn daughter, and she felt the understanding move through her like cold water, and she still did not scream. She turned, crossed the room in 4 steps. She grabbed the small canvas bag she kept packed beneath the cot, a habit from years of not quite trusting stillness, not quite believing safety was permanent, and she slung it over one shoulder and she looked at the window. Too far down. She'd land wrong. In her condition, a drop like that onto hard summer-baked earth could do damage she could not afford. The door, then. She thought of it the same way she'd always thought through trouble, not with panic, but with the flat, methodical focus that had gotten her through her mother's death and her father's debts and 2 years of stretching a household budget until it was practically translucent. She thought there are men in the kitchen. There is a hallway. The front door is beyond the hallway. The men came in the front. So, the back of the house. The root cellar door. The gap in the side fence that Samuel kept meaning to fix and never did. She eased the bedroom door open. The hallway was empty. She moved along the wall, one hand trailing plaster, slow and deliberate, because she could not afford to rush and fall, and she could not afford to be heard. The kitchen voices continued behind her. Samuel saying something about the heat. The flat-voiced man saying something she couldn't catch. A third voice, rougher, laughing at something that wasn't funny. She reached the back door. The latch was stiff from the summer humidity. She worked it with both hands, teeth-clenched arms shaking slightly from the effort of doing anything quietly, while 8 months pregnant and terrified. The latch gave. The door swung open onto the white blaze of a Montana summer morning. She stepped out. The heat hit her like a wall. It was barely past 6, and already the air was thick and still, and tasting of dust and dry grass, and the particular flatness of a summer that had gone on too long. She moved across the yard toward the fence gap bag, bouncing against her hip, one hand cradling her belly from underneath, and she was almost there. "Miss Whitaker." She stopped. The voice came from her right. She turned, and there were 2 men leaning against the side of the barn. They had been waiting. They had known about the back door. They had let her think she was clever, and they had waited. One of them was tall and thin, with a face like cracked leather. The other was built like a grain barn, wide through the shoulders and short through the neck, with small pale eyes that moved over her in a way that made her skin tighten. "Morning," the tall one said, pleasant as anything. "Mr. Crow sends his regards." She looked at them. She looked at the fence gap behind them, not 6 feet away. She looked at the bag on her shoulder. She looked at the sky, white, blue, and merciless. And she thought, I could run. I could not run. I could scream. Screaming would bring Samuel, and Samuel had already made his choice. She thought, I have approximately 4 seconds before the man in the barn makes a move, and I need to use them. "What does Mr. Crow want with me?" she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "Got himself a contract," the tall one said. "Domestic work. Cooking, cleaning, keeping books. You got a head for numbers, he's told." A pause. "Your brother spoke well of you." "I imagine he did." "Ma'am, it'd be easier all around if you didn't make this hard." "I'm not making anything hard," Grace said. "I'm asking a question. I'm allowed to ask questions." The tall one smiled. "Sure you are. Then let me ask another one. That contract, is it signed by me or just by my brother?" The smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of something that might have been reluctance. "Mr. Crow handles his paperwork thorough." "That's not what I asked." "Ma'am." "Is my name on that contract?" The tall one glanced at the barn-built man. The barn-built man shrugged. "Don't much matter," the tall one said. "Law in this territory gives a male guardian." "I'm 23 years old," Grace said. "I have been supporting this household for 2 years. I kept the accounts, I paid the taxes, I filed the deed renewal last October. My name is on that deed. My name is on the tax record. I am not a ward, and I am not a child, and I am not property. And whatever my brother signed, he did not have the legal authority to sign it." Silence. The tall one looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Be that as it may." And he stepped forward. They put rope around her wrists. Not brutal, she would think about that later. The strange, calculated moderation of it, as if they had done this before, and knew exactly how much force was necessary, and did not enjoy excess. Her wrists in front of her loose enough that the circulation held tight enough that she couldn't work free. Without time, she wouldn't have. The tall one apologized. She didn't respond. They walked her to the wagon at the front of the house. Samuel was standing on the porch. She looked at him. He looked back. He was wearing the blue shirt she'd mended for him twice, the one with the tear at the left elbow she'd patched with a square of darker fabric because they couldn't afford a perfect match. He was holding his hat in both hands and turning the brim between his fingers the way he did when he was ashamed of something and trying to decide whether to feel it. "Samuel," she said. He looked at his hat. "Samuel, look at me." He looked up. His eyes were red. That surprised her. She had not expected remorse. She had expected greed, weakness, the ordinary failure of a man who made small choices until they accumulated into something monstrous. She had not expected him to be crying about it. "How much?" she said. He shook his head. "How much did he pay you?" "Grace. I want to know the number, Samuel. I want to know what I was worth to you." He said nothing. He looked at his hat again. She turned away from him. She thought, "I will not look at him again." She thought, "When this is over, and it will be over, I will think about whether I mean that." But right now she turned away from her brother and she walked to the wagon with two of Crow's men flanking her, and the sun already hammering down on the back of her neck, and her daughter kicking insistently beneath her ribs, and she thought, "I am going to get out of this." She thought, "I have gotten out of worse." She thought, "I have a ledger number memorized, a deed in my name, and a head for figures that nobody in this territory has bothered to reckon with." She thought, "Let them underestimate me. They already have, and they don't even know it yet." The wagon was a working rig, flat-bedded, sun-bleached, the kind used for hauling goods rather than passengers. There were two other men on the bench and a third in the bed who didn't look at her directly. She was helped up, not unkindly, which she found obscene, and settled against the sideboards with her bag beside her, and the ropes on her wrists, and the baby pressing down with a heaviness that had no interest in the urgency of the situation. The road out of the Whitaker property ran northeast along the base of the hills for about 2 miles before it joined the main track toward Crow's holdings. She knew this road. She had walked it 100 times. She knew where it dipped low near the dry creek bed where the wagon would slow and the driver would have to manage the wheels carefully. She knew the stand of cottonwoods on the far side of the dip where the shade was dense and the undergrowth thick, and the distance to the tree line was no more than 20 yards. She had 23 years of hard-learned patience and a daughter who needed her to be smarter than afraid. She sat in the wagon bed and counted her breaths and watched the road unroll behind them, and she waited. The man in the wagon bed had a rifle laid across his knees. He was watching the tree line to their left, not her. The two men on the bench were talking about the heat. The tall one who'd tied her wrists had ridden ahead on horseback, already out of sight. The wagon hit the dip. The driver hauled back on the reins. The horses balked and slowed, and the left rear wheel dropped into the soft earth at the creek crossing, and the whole rig lurched hard to that side. The man with the rifle grabbed the boards. One of the benchmen swore. The driver stood up on the footboard to see the wheel. Grace moved. She went over the right side, not the left. She went over it awkwardly, heavily, dropping more than jumping her bound wrists in front of her to break the impact. And she hit the road, and the impact shot up through her palms and her arms, and she was moving before the dust settled, moving toward the cottonwoods, moving with the low, ungainly urgency of a woman 8 months pregnant who has decided that ungainly and urgent will simply have to be enough. Behind her shouting, the driver, the benchman, not the rifleman yet. She heard the scrape of him getting upright on the lurching wagon. She hit the undergrowth at the tree line and pushed through it. Branches caught at her hair and her dress and her bag, and she pushed through them and kept going, angling uphill, knowing the slope would slow her, but also knowing it would slow heavier men more. Her breath was already ragged. Her hips ached with every stride. The baby dropped lower, with each step the weight of her shifting and pulling, and Grace kept her bound hands low and kept moving and did not look back. She heard them in the undergrowth behind her, 2 of them by the sound of it, moving fast, crashing through the brush with the confidence of men who expected to catch what they were chasing. She veered left, came down off the slope, and hit the dry creek bed, and turned along it, following the cut of it where the banks were high enough to hide her head, if she crouched where the gravel was packed and firm enough to run on. Her left ankle rolled on a loose stone. She went down on one knee, both hands slamming into the gravel, and the pain was white and immediate. And she was back up before she registered it, fully back up and moving, because stopping was the one thing she absolutely could not do. She could hear them, closer now. She rounded the bend in the creek bed and stopped. The banks dropped low. The tree cover ended. Ahead of her 30 yards of open ground, and on the far side of it, a fence line. A worked fence, posts evenly spaced, wire tight and new. Beyond the fence, cattle. Beyond the cattle, in the middle distance, the shapes of buildings. Someone's ranch. She looked behind her. She could hear the men, but not see them, yet the bend was still hiding her. She went for the fence. She crossed the open ground at the best pace she could manage. She reached the wire and went through it the way she'd gone through a dozen fences in her life, one wire up, one wire down, angled sideways, grateful for the first time that the wire was new enough to have some give. She scraped her forearm going through. She didn't stop. On the other side, she kept walking, then stumbling, then walking again. She was bleeding somewhere, her knee from the fall, she thought, and her forearm from the wire. The sun was full up now, slamming down on the open pasture without mercy, and the baby was pressing down so hard she could feel the shape of it with every step, that dense, absolute weight of another person, depending entirely on her continuing to function. She made it maybe 50 yards past the fence line before her legs stopped cooperating. She did not fall so much as fold. She went down to her knees in the dry summer grass and put her bound hands against the ground and breathed. Her vision swam. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, thick and fast. Behind her, somewhere back past the fence, she could hear voices, two men arguing about which direction she'd gone. She pressed her forehead to the backs of her hands and pulled air in through her nose and out through her mouth and said very quietly to her daughter, "We're all right. We are going to be all right. I just need 1 minute." Anna kicked. "I know," Grace whispered. "I know. 1 minute." She raised her head. There was a man on horseback, 20 feet away, watching her. He was sitting absolutely still on a dark bay horse, one hand resting easy on the saddle horn hat brim pulled low against the morning sun. He was watching her with an expression she could not read from this distance. Not cold, not warm, simply present. Taking in what was in front of him. She looked at him. She looked at the blood on her forearm. She looked at the rope around her wrists. She looked back at him. "This your land?" she said. "It is," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who had no particular need to rush anything. "Then I'm sorry for crossing your fence." He was quiet for a moment. He glanced past her toward the direction she'd come from, where the voices were still audible, moving now in a way that suggested the men had found the fence crossing and were working out how to follow. He looked back at her. "Those men with you?" he said. "No," she said. "Those men are the reason I'm on your land." Another pause. He looked at her wrists. "You need those cut." She had been holding herself together for the better part of an hour through sheer calcified will and the absolute refusal to let a single thing she was feeling show on her face. She had not cried in front of Samuel. She had not flinched when they tied her. She had not made a sound when her knee hit the gravel or her arm hit the wire. She had kept her voice steady through every word she'd said, and she had kept moving when her body was begging her to stop. She looked at this man on his dark bay horse in the white summer light, with her bound wrists and her bleeding forearm and her daughter kicking insistently beneath her ribs, and she said, "Yes, I do." He stepped down from the saddle in one motion and came toward her, and he took a folding knife from his vest pocket and opened it, and he crouched in front of her in the dry summer grass and cut the rope. It took 3 seconds. Her wrists came free, and she brought them to her chest and pressed them there, feeling the blood come back, feeling the ordinary miracle of her own circulation, and she looked at this man. His face was weathered and serious, dark eyes that moved over her in a way that was assessing but not invasive. taking stock of the facts of her situation with the same flat practicality she'd always used herself, and she said, "Thank you." "Elias Boone," he said. "This is the Boone Ranch." He straightened up, folded the knife, put it away. He looked past her again. The voices were getting closer. He looked back down at her. "Can you stand?" "Yes," she said. He put out his hand. She took it. He pulled her to her feet with steady impersonal strength, and he held on until she had her balance, and then he let go. "All right," he said. "Let's get you inside before those men find their way through that fence." A beat. "How far along are you?" 8 months, she said. He absorbed this the way he seemed to absorb everything without reaction, as simple information that required a response rather than a feeling. "Then we move slow and careful." "I can move faster than you think." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, not enough to call it that, but something. "I don't doubt it," he said. Behind her, through the fence, she heard one of Crow's men shout to the other that he'd found her tracks. Elias Boone turned toward the ranch buildings and said without particular urgency, "Come on then." She followed him. She did not look back at the fence. She did not look back at the road she'd come from, or the wagon, or the brother standing on the porch, turning his hat brim in his hands. She looked forward at the ranch buildings in the distance and the serious, steady-moving man ahead of her. And she thought there is a ledger somewhere in Silas Crow's wagon with 43 women's names in it. She thought, I have an excellent memory for numbers. She thought, I do not know yet what Elias Boone's angle is. I do not know yet whether this is rescue or just a different kind of transaction. I have learned in the last hour that I cannot afford to assume that a man's kindness is the same thing as his loyalty, and I will not make that mistake again. But she thought he cut the rope. He didn't ask questions first. He cut the rope, and then he asked. That was something. That was a place to start. She pressed her hand flat against the side of her belly. Anna was quiet now, finally, as if she too understood that the running part was over and the thinking part was about to begin, and she walked toward Elias Boone's ranch in the white Montana summer heat, and she began with the careful and methodical part of her mind that had never once stopped working to make a plan. Elias Boone did not take her through the front door. He took her around the side of the main house through a low gate and into the kitchen by the back entry. The working entrance, the one used by people who belonged to the place, rather than people who were being presented to it. She noticed that. She filed it away without deciding yet what it meant. The kitchen was cool compared to the outside, the walls thick enough to hold the night air until mid-morning. A woman stood at the stove, broad-shouldered, and somewhere past 60, with gray hair pinned back and a face that had made its peace with hard weather a long time ago. She turned when they came in and looked at Grace the way experienced women look at trouble, not with alarm, but with the immediate practical assessment of someone calculating what would be needed. "Ruth," Elias said. "This is Grace Whitaker. She needs water, something to eat, and someone to look at her arm and her knee." Ruth Bell looked at the blood on Grace's forearm. She looked at the rope marks on her wrists already purpling. She looked at the size of Grace's belly and the set of Grace's jaw, and the particular kind of exhaustion that lives behind a person's eyes when they have been running on will alone for longer than the body was designed to manage. "Sit down," Ruth said, not unkindly. The same tone she'd probably use with a horse that had come in lathered. Grace sat. Elias went back outside. Grace heard him on the porch, heard a second voice, one of the ranch hands low and quick, and then the sound of boots moving with purpose toward the fence line. She did not ask. She focused on breathing, on keeping her hands flat against her thighs, on not letting the shaking she felt building in her chest come out anywhere it could be seen. Ruth set a cup of water in front of her. Grace drank half of it before she put it down. "How far along?" Ruth asked, already working at the cut on Grace's forearm with a damp cloth. 8 months, maybe closer to 8.5. "Baby moving regular?" "She won't stop." Ruth made a sound that might have been approval. "Good. That's good." She pressed the cloth against the cut. Grace didn't flinch. Ruth glanced up at her. "You ride out this way often?" "First time on this property," Grace said. "I came through the fence." "I can see that." She nodded at the wire scrape. "Crow's men." Grace went still. You know them. I know of them. Everybody in this county knows of them. Ruth tied off a strip of clean linen around Grace's forearm with the efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work all her life. Elias has had dealings with Silas Crow before. Nothing settled. She paused. Sit forward. Let me see your knee. Grace sat forward. She said, What kind of dealings? Ruth looked at her steadily for a moment. That's his to tell. Grace accepted that. She had not earned the story yet, and she knew it. She sat still while Ruth cleaned her knee, and she drank the rest of the water, and she thought about the wagon. Somewhere back on that road, and the ledger inside it, and the 43 names she'd seen written in a column on the page, she'd caught a glimpse of through the canvas flap when they'd loaded her in. She had read 7 of them before the flap swung shut. She had all 7 memorized. She needed the rest. Elias came back in 20 minutes later. He came to the table and stood across from her and said without preamble, They're off the property, rode back toward the main road. A pause. They'll report to Crow. I know, Grace said. He'll send more men, or come himself. I know that too. He looked at her. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put both forearms on the table and looked at her the way he'd looked at the situation out in the pasture, straight at it, without flinching away from what it was. Tell me what happened. So she told him. She told it the way she always processed things, linear, factual. The emotional content of it kept separate from the information, because the information was what they needed right now. And she could feel everything else later when it was useful. She told him about Samuel, about the letter from the land office, about the figure on the back of the envelope and the names she'd heard. She told him about the rope and the wagon and the creek crossing and the fence. When she got to the ledger, he sat forward slightly. You saw it. 7 names before the flap closed. I have them memorized. She said them. All 7. Steady clear in the order she'd read them. Elias was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his face that she couldn't name. Mary Alcott is on that list. 3rd name. Mary Alcott, age 19, contracted February of last year. He put one hand flat on the table. He looked at that hand. Then he looked back up at her. Mary Alcott was a neighbor's daughter, he said. She disappeared 14 months ago. Her father was told she'd taken work in Denver. Willingly. The kitchen was very quiet. She didn't, Grace said. No, Elias said. I don't reckon she did. Ruth set a plate on the table between them. Biscuits and cold beef and a small dish of preserved peaches. Neither of them looked at it for a moment. Then Ruth said, Eat, and Grace picked up a biscuit because her body required it regardless of what her mind was doing, and she ate. Elias watched her eat. Not in a way that made her feel observed in the way of a man deciding something. She let him decide. She was deciding things herself. The ledger is still in that wagon, she said. Most likely. Crow will move it when he realizes I saw it. Yes. So we have a day, maybe less. She set down the biscuit. That ledger has decades in it. I saw the binding, it wasn't new. The pages were thick. Whatever Crow has been doing, it didn't start with me, and it didn't start with Mary Alcott. She looked at him directly. You said you've had dealings with him. He was quiet for a beat. Then, he's been buying land in this county for 6 years. Small parcels mostly. Widows, men with debt, people who needed fast money. Some of it was straight purchase. Some of it... He stopped. There was a family, the Hargroves, 3 years ago. Their deed went missing out of the land office. Crow filed on the parcel 4 months later. By the time they found a lawyer willing to take it, the judge had already approved the transfer. Who was the judge? Hendricks. He retired last year. A pause. The new Judge Alderton came up from the territorial capital. He's got no connection to Crow that anyone's found. Grace felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something more like the identification of a possible foothold. Then Alderton is where we go. Elias looked at her. With the ledger, she said. And with documentation from the land office. I have the deed to the Whitaker property in my bag. I filed the renewal myself. My name is on it, not Samuel's, which means whatever Samuel signed over to Crow is legally void. I can prove that." She paused. "But the ledger is the larger thing. If those 43 names are what I think they are, forged contracts, coerced labor agreements, women signed over by fathers and brothers and husbands who had no legal authority to sign them, then Crow isn't just a man who cheated a few families out of land. He's been running something systematic for years." The words sat on the table between them. Elias said, "You know how to read a contract." "I kept books for my father from the time I was 14. After he died, I kept them for the household for our taxes for the deed renewal. I've read enough legal documents to know what a forged signature looks like and what coerced language looks like." She looked at him steadily. "I need that ledger, Mr. Boone." "Elias," he said. A pause. "Elias." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. She did not drop her eyes, and she did not qualify what she'd said. She had stated a fact, and she was prepared to let it stand. "All right," he said finally. "I know where Crow stages his wagons when he's moving through this part of the county. Old relay station off the North Fork Road. He used it last summer when he was hauling materials for the new bunkhouse." He stood. "If he went back to report, the wagon'll be sitting there while he decides what to do about you. An hour at most before he sends men back. Then we have less than an hour to get to the relay station." He looked at her belly. She looked at him, looking at her belly. "I'm not made of glass," she said. "Didn't say you were. You were thinking it." Something shifted in his face again, that almost thing that wasn't quite a smile. "I was thinking you shouldn't have to do this." "That's different," she said. "That's true, but it doesn't change what needs doing." He held her gaze for another moment and then nodded once, the way a man nods when he's decided that the person in front of him is exactly who they appear to be and the conversation is over. "Finish eating," he said. "I'll get the horses." "I can ride," she said, because she'd seen him about to suggest the wagon. "I know," he said, and went outside. Ruth looked at Grace across the kitchen. Grace looked back. "He's a good man," Ruth said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was delivered like a data point, like information Ruth thought Grace should have and would know how to use. "I'm starting to see that," Grace said. She ate the rest of the biscuit. She ate 2 of the preserved peaches. She did it methodically, fueling the body that had already performed beyond reasonable expectation this morning and was going to be asked to perform further. Anna had gone quiet again, in that way she did, sometimes not absent, just still, as if she too understood that right now the job was waiting and watching and saving the energy for what came next. They rode out 25 minutes later, Grace on a steady roan mare that Elias had chosen without asking her preference, which she appreciated because it meant he'd paid attention and made a decision based on what he'd observed rather than on politeness. The mare was calm and broad-backed and moved with a smooth rolling gait that was kind on a rider in Grace's condition. She noticed him notice that she sat the horse correctly, that she had her balance and her hands and wasn't going to need managing. Neither of them spoke much on the way to the relay station. That was fine. Grace had never believed that silence needed filling. She used the ride to think, to go through what she knew, what she needed, what she would do when they got to the ledger, and what she would do if it wasn't there. The relay station came up on the left side of the North Fork Road, set back behind a stand of overgrown brush that had gone brown and crackling in the summer heat. There was a wagon in the yard. Same flat-bedded rig, same sun-bleached boards. The dark bay horse Elias had been riding earlier, he'd switched to a gray, flicked its ears toward the station, but didn't alarm. One man visible. Sitting on the station steps with his hat over his face, apparently sleeping. Elias stopped them back in the tree cover. He looked at the station, and looked at the man, and looked at the wagon. Then he looked at Grace. She was already looking at the wagon. "Canvas flap is on the left side," she said quietly. The ledger was sitting on top of a wooden crate just inside. Black cover, brown spine. Thick. He was quiet for a moment. "One man visible." "There's usually at least one more," Inside the station, most likely. He was quiet, thinking. If I go straight for the wagon, the man on the steps wakes up before I reach it. If I go around the back of the station, I come out on the wrong side. Send me, Grace said. He turned and looked at her. He's not going to expect a pregnant woman to come walking up the road, she said. And even if he does wake up, what's he going to do? He's looking for a runaway, not an arrival. I can get to the wagon while he's trying to work out what he's seeing. She kept her voice even. I'm faster than I look, and I'm quieter than you'd expect. And I've already run from these men once today. I know how they move. Elias looked at her for a long moment. She could see him weighing at the logic of it against something else, something that wasn't logic. If it goes wrong, he said. If it goes wrong, you ride in and make noise, and I go back through whatever gap presents itself. I'm good at finding gaps. He said nothing. Elias. She waited until he looked at her directly. I need to be the one who gets that ledger. Not because I don't trust you, but because when we stand in front of Judge Alderton, the chain of evidence matters. I found the ledger. I can speak to what was in it, and what I saw, and when. If you retrieve it, Crow's lawyer stands up and says an interested party tampered with evidence. She paused. But a pregnant woman who ran from a forced labor contract and recovered the instrument of her own coercion, that's a different story. He was still looking at her. You know I'm right, she said. I know you're right, he said. That doesn't mean I like it. You don't have to like it. You just have to let me do it. Another pause. Then, I'll be 20 feet back in the brush on the horse, ready to move on your signal. That's all I'm asking. She dismounted carefully, handing him the roan's reins, and she walked out of the tree cover and onto the North Fork Road, and she did not hurry. She walked with the particular deliberate pace of a woman who has somewhere to be, and every right to be going there. She walked with her spine straight, and her hands quiet at her sides, and her daughter pressing down with every step in that familiar relentless grounding weight. The man on the steps stirred when she was 15 yards out. The hat came up. He squinted at her. She kept walking. Ma'am. He was sitting up now, confused. A young man, she realized as she got closer, younger than she'd expected. 20 at most, soft around the jaw, with the uncertain look of someone doing a job he hadn't fully thought through. Ma'am, this is private property. I left something in that wagon, Grace said pleasantly. Just need to collect it. You what? He was on his feet now, blinking. What wagon? What are you? He looked at her belly. He looked at the road behind her. He looked back at her. Who are you? Grace Whitaker, she said. And you are on Booneland, son. This relay station sits on the northeast corner of the Boone property. Mr. Boone doesn't recall giving Mr. Crow permission to stage his wagons here. She said it the same way she said everything, steady, clear-grounded in enough specific detail that it sounded like established fact even if it wasn't entirely. Now, I would very much like to collect my property from that wagon, and you are welcome to go ahead and tell Mr. Crow that's what happened. The young man's mouth opened. He looked behind him at the station door. He looked at her. He looked at the wagon. She walked past him to the wagon and lifted the canvas flap and reached inside. The ledger was exactly where she'd seen it. Black cover, brown spine, thick as a Bible. She pulled it out with both hands and held it against her chest and let the canvas flap fall. The young man was still standing by the station steps, looking at her with the expression of someone who has been presented with a situation that his instructions did not cover. Thank you, Grace said. She turned and walked back up the road. Her heart was going at twice its normal rate. Her hands were perfectly steady. She walked back into the tree cover, and Elias was there with both horses, and he looked at the ledger against her chest, and his jaw tightened slightly. Not with alarm, she thought, but with something that might have been the same feeling she was having. The feeling of a plan moving into contact with reality and holding its shape. She handed the ledger to him while she remounted. He held it without opening it. When she was settled on the roan and had her balance, he handed it back. She held it with both arms wrapped around it, and she thought 43 names. A decade or more of forged contracts and coerced agreements, and women who had no one standing between them and Silas Crow's methodical, profitable machinery of exploitation. She thought they have names now. They have a ledger. They have a deed in her bag and a judge in the territorial seat with no connection to Crow and an honest rancher who knew Mary Alcott's father. She thought, this is not over. This is barely begun. But the difference between this morning and this moment is that this morning she had nothing, and right now she has everything she needs to start. Anna kicked once hard against the lower left side of her ribs. "I know," Grace said quietly. "I know." Elias looked at her. "Talking to the baby," she said. He nodded the way he nodded at all information as simple fact requiring no comment. He turned his horse toward the main road. She followed. And somewhere behind them in the relay station, the young man with the soft jaw was about to walk inside and tell whoever was waiting there that a pregnant woman had just taken the ledger and that she had known exactly what she was looking for and that she had not looked afraid at all. They were back at the Boone Ranch before the noon heat peaked, and Grace sat at Ruth's kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and did not look up for 2 hours. She read the way she did everything methodically, completely moving through each page with the same focused attention she'd given to her father's account books and the household tax records and every legal document she'd handled in the last 5 years. She read and she remembered. That was her particular ability, the one that had never failed her, the capacity to hold numbers and names and dates in her mind with the precision of a written record. Her father had called it a gift. Her schoolteacher had called it unusual. Samuel had never mentioned it, which she understood now as the particular oversight of a man who had decided what his sister was worth and stopped looking after that. Elias sat across from her. He didn't read over her shoulder. He drank coffee and waited, and the quality of his waiting was different from most people's. It wasn't restless or impatient. It was the same deliberate stillness he brought to everything. The stillness of a man who understood that some work required time, and that inserting yourself into it didn't make it go faster. Ruth moved around the kitchen behind them. At some point, she set food on the table. Grace ate without looking away from the ledger. By the time she turned the last page, she had 43 names, 43 dates, 43 contract amounts, and a column of notations in a cramped, precise hand that she understood immediately as a secondary accounting system. A running record of labor extracted against amounts owed with the balances always calculated in Crow's favor, the debts always growing, the contracts always renewing. It was elegant in its ugliness. The kind of system built by a man who understood leverage and had decided that the law was simply another form of it. She closed the ledger. 43 women, she said. Oldest contract dates back 11 years. The youngest woman on this list was 16. She looked at Elias. He's been running this since before I was old enough to understand what a contract was. Elias set down his coffee cup. How many are still under active contract? 19. She pressed her hand flat on the cover. 19 women currently listed as active. The rest are marked settled, which in his notation system means either the contract was paid out, which I don't believe happened in more than 2 or 3 cases, or the woman is gone. Ruth had stopped moving behind them. "Gone how?" she said. Grace looked up at her. "I don't know. He doesn't specify, but the notation is a single line drawn through the name." She paused. "Not closed, not resolved, just crossed out." The kitchen held that for a moment. "There are 3 land parcels documented in the back section," Grace continued, because she could not let herself stop moving through the information, or she would have to feel all of it at once, and that would have to wait. "The Hargrove parcel is one of them. The documentation shows the deed was not misplaced from the land office. It was removed. There's a receipt of payment in here, $15 to a clerk named Gerald Pitts with a note in Crow's hand. Move and file." Elias went very still. "Gerald Pitts," he said. "You know him. He's still a clerk at the land office." A pause. "I've spoken to him twice about the Hargrove situation." Grace looked at him steadily. "Then he's known what happened the whole time." "Yes." The word came out flat and controlled the way a man speaks when he is managing something large and does not want to mishandle it. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment. She watched him. She understood what he was doing. Not walking away, just giving himself the 10 seconds he needed to decide what to do with the anger before it decided for him. She respected that. She did the same thing. He turned back. "We need to move on Alderton today. If Crow knows you have the ledger." "He knows," she said. "That boy at the relay station ran inside the moment I cleared the yard. Crow will have word within the hour. Then we have 2 hours before he files something with Pitts to complicate the land record, maybe less before he puts men on the road to Alderton's courthouse." He looked at her. "Can you ride that far?" "How far?" 14 miles. She thought about her back. She thought about her hips. She thought about the 19 women with active contracts and the names crossed through with a single line. "Yes," she said. "Grace." His voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, more direct, like he was putting something down that he'd been carrying at a careful distance. "You don't have to be the one to stand in that courtroom. I can testify to what I've seen. The ledger speaks for itself." She looked at him for a long moment. She understood what he was offering and why he was offering it, and she understood that it came from the same place. Everything else he'd done came from. Not pity, not the management of a problem, but something that looked a great deal like genuine concern for a person rather than a situation. She had been handling people's concern for a long time, and she knew the difference. 11 years ago, she said. A 16-year-old girl signed a contract she didn't understand and probably couldn't read, and nobody stood in a courtroom for her. Nobody read her name out loud in a room where it had to be recorded. She looked at the ledger. "I can read. I can remember every word in that book. And I was in that wagon. My name was going to be the 44th. She looked back at him. "I'm going to stand in that courtroom." He held her gaze. Then he nodded. "One time. Done." They rode out within the hour. Ruth pressed a wrapped bundle of food into Grace's bag and held Grace's hand for a moment before letting go. Not a long gesture, not sentimental, just the particular grip of a woman who had seen enough to know when something mattered and wanted it acknowledged. The road to Alderton's courthouse ran along the valley floor, mostly flat, with the summer heat pressing down from above and radiating back up from the baked earth below, the kind of heat that made the distance shimmer and turned the hills at the horizon into something uncertain. Grace rode and did not complain about the heat or her back or the increasingly insistent pressure in her hips that had been building since the morning's exertions. She rode and she went through the ledger in her mind, organizing it the way she organized everything into the shape of an argument. Evidence laid in sequence, each piece supporting the next. They were 6 miles out when they heard the horses behind them. Elias heard it first. He turned his head slightly, the way a man does when he's caught a sound he expected but hoped not to hear. He didn't reach for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. He looked back over his shoulder with the flat, assessing gaze he seemed to bring to all incoming problems. 3 riders, he said. Maybe 4. Grace turned and looked. Dust on the road behind them, still distant, but closing. Crow, or his men. Crow himself doesn't usually ride dirty work. He looked forward again, calculating. We can push the pace. Get to the courthouse before they close the distance if the horses hold. Then we push the pace, she said. He glanced at her belly. Elias, she said. I know, he said. I know. He put his heels to the gray. She put hers to the roan, and the roan responded with a smooth, ground-eating lope that was fast without being brutal, and they rode hard into the white afternoon heat with 4 riders eating up the distance behind them. Grace held the ledger inside her bag, one hand pressed against it through the canvas. She kept her body balanced over the horse's movement, the way she'd been taught as a girl, keeping her weight off her back, staying forward, moving with the horse rather than against it. Her breath was harder than she liked. The baby had dropped lower again, and each stride sent a rolling liquid pressure through her pelvis that was uncomfortable in a way that was different from the ordinary discomfort of the last 2 months. She did not mention this. They came into Alderton's town at a canter, and Grace recognized the courthouse immediately. the only two-story wooden building on the main street with a territorial flag hanging limp in the dead summer air. Elias was off his horse before it had fully stopped, and he had his hand up to help her dismount, and she took it because getting down fast was harder than getting up fast, and she was not going to fall on the steps of the courthouse. She dismounted. She had the ledger out of the bag before her feet were firmly on the ground. "They're 2 minutes behind us," Elias said. "Then we walk fast," she said. They went up the courthouse steps together. The clerk inside was a young man with sleeve garters and an ink-stained cuff who looked up with the automatic mild annoyance of someone interrupted in routine work, and then looked at Grace, the blood-stained linen on her forearm, the size of her belly, the ledger held against her chest, the rope marks still visible at her wrists, and the annoyance became something more alert. "We need Judge Alderton," Elias said. "Today, now. It is not a matter that can be scheduled." "The judge is in." "I know what he's in," Elias said. "Tell him Elias Boone is here about the Hargrove deed and the Whitaker contract and a ledger belonging to Silas Crow that documents 11 years of fraud in this territory. Tell him we have about 90 seconds before Crow's men come through that door and try to take it back." A pause. "And tell him there's a pregnant woman standing in his courthouse who has been awake since before dawn and ran 2 miles through brush this morning and would very much like to sit down in front of a man with the authority to make this stop." The clerk stood up so fast he knocked his ink bottle. He was through the inner door in 10 seconds. Grace looked at Elias. "Good speech," she said. "Meant every word," he said. The inner door opened again, and the clerk said, "Come through," and they came through, and Judge Alderton was a compact man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a desk covered in organized paper and the look of a man who had heard a great many things in courtrooms and was not easily surprised. He looked at Grace. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Elias. "Boone," he said, "sit down all of you and talk fast." Grace sat. She opened the ledger on the edge of his desk and she began to talk. She was 3 minutes in. Names. Dates, the notation system, the Hargrove deed, removal. Gerald Pitts when the outer door of the courthouse opened and closed hard. Voices in the clerk's office. The clerk's voice higher and less certain than it had been. Another voice flat and familiar. The tall man with the cracked leather face. Grace kept talking. She did not raise her voice. She kept her eyes on Alderton and kept moving through the evidence in the order she'd organized it because she was not going to let the sound of that voice interrupt what she was doing. Not now, not when she was this close. Alderton raised one hand slightly without looking away from her. He raised his voice just enough to carry. "Chambers are in session. Anyone who opens that door is in contempt." Silence from the outer office. Grace kept talking. She got through the land fraud section. She got through the contracts. She got through the notation system and what she believed the crossed-out names represented. She set the ledger in front of Alderton and showed him the pages, and he leaned forward and read with the focused attention of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. Then she set her deed on the desk beside the ledger. "This is the Whitaker property deed," she said. "My name, filed last October. My brother had no legal authority to contract me to anyone. Whatever he signed is void." She paused. "I want that on record before anything else happens today, because I want it established that I am not a ward. I am not property, and I came here of my own will with evidence I recovered from that wagon, because it is the evidence of crimes committed against 43 women, and someone needed to bring it to a judge who would actually look at it." Alderton looked at her over the ledger for a long moment. "How old are you?" he said. 23. "And you read this entire ledger this morning?" "I have a head for figures," she said. "I remember what I read." He was quiet. Then he looked at Elias. "You'll testify to the circumstances of recovery." "I will," Elias said. "And the Hargrove situation you have direct knowledge. The family is still in this county. I can bring them." Alderton nodded slowly. He looked at the door behind which the flat-voiced man was presumably waiting, with whatever instructions Crow had sent him with. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Grace. "Miss Whitaker," he said, "I am going to ask you to stay in this courthouse for the rest of the afternoon. I'm going to send my clerk to fetch the sheriff. I am going to take this ledger into territorial custody." He paused. "And I am going to ask you once more and formally whether you are prepared to stand before this court and testify to everything you've just told me." Grace looked at him. She thought about a 16-year-old girl signing a contract she couldn't read. She thought about 19 women with active contracts and 24 names crossed through with a single line. She thought about her brother on the porch with his hat in his hands, crying about something he'd already done. She thought about Anna, quiet now, still waiting. "Yes," she said. "I'm prepared." Alderton stood. He crossed to the inner door that led to the courtroom and opened it and said to someone inside, "Clear the afternoon. We're in session." He turned back. "Mr. Boone, the outer door if you would." Elias stood and crossed to the outer office door and opened it. The tall man was standing just inside. Behind him, 2 others. All 3 of them looked past Elias at Grace at the ledger on Alderton's desk, now in the judge's hands, and the tall man's face went through something complicated, and then went flat. "Gentlemen," Alderton said from behind Grace, "this court is in session. You are welcome to be seated in the gallery, or you are welcome to leave. You are not welcome to conduct business on behalf of Silas Crow on these premises today." A pause. "The ledger you have come for is now in territorial custody. If Mr. Crow wishes to dispute that, he may appear before this court at the scheduled hearing which I will set for Thursday next." Another pause, and something entered his voice that had not been there before. Not anger, just finality. The sound of a door being closed by someone with the authority to close it. "If he sends men here again before that date, I will add obstruction to the charges I am currently considering." The tall man looked at Grace for a long moment. She looked back at him. She did not look away. He turned and walked out. The other 2 followed. The courthouse door swung shut behind them. Grace let out a breath she had been holding, she realized since she'd heard that voice in the outer office. Just one breath, slow, deliberate, the breath of someone who has been managing their own reactions for so many hours that releasing one feels almost dangerous. Elias was watching her. Not with pity, not with the careful management of someone handling a fragile thing. He was watching her the way he'd watched her all day, with the steady, simple attention of a man who had decided she was worth watching. Who had been paying attention and kept paying attention, and had not once looked at what was in front of him, and tried to make it into something smaller than it was. "You all right?" he said. She put her hand on her belly. Anna stirred under her palm a long, slow roll, less urgent than the morning's insistent kicks. As if she too had been holding something, and was only now beginning to let it ease. "I'll tell you in about 10 minutes, Grace said. "After I've sat still for a moment." He nodded. He sat back down in the chair beside hers, not close enough to crowd her close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him. The same steadiness that had been there since he crouched in the dry summer grass and cut the rope from her wrists in 3 seconds without asking a single question first. Outside through the courthouse walls, the summer heat continued its indifferent work on the valley. Crow's men were somewhere on that road riding back with empty hands and a message they were not going to enjoy delivering. Gerald Pitts was at a desk in the land office 9 miles away, not yet knowing that his name was written in a ledger now sitting in Alderton's hands. Samuel Whitaker was on a porch somewhere, turning his hat brim, deciding what kind of man he intended to be going forward. And in a courtroom that smelled of wood and old paper, and the particular dry heat of a Montana summer, a 23-year-old woman with rope marks on her wrists and a daughter pressing down beneath her ribs sat with a deed in her name and 43 women's names in her memory, and thought, Thursday. She thought, I will be ready. Thursday came in hot and airless, the kind of morning that made the whole valley feel like it was holding its breath. Grace had not slept well. She had slept at the Boone Ranch. Ruth had made that non-negotiable in the way Ruth made most things non-negotiable, which was simply by doing them and leaving no reasonable space for argument. But the sleep had been shallow and interrupted, full of names and dates, and the particular anxiety of a mind that has organized everything it can organize and must now simply wait for the moment to arrive. Anna had been restless too, moving through the night with an urgency that felt almost communicative, as if she understood that today was the day everything turned. Grace was dressed and at Ruth's kitchen table before sunrise, going through the ledger one final time. Not because she needed to, she had every page memorized, every notation, every amount, but because the act of reading it again was the act of honoring what was in it. 43 names, each one a person, each one a story that had been managed and minimized and crossed out or filed away by a man who had decided that the law was something he could purchase rather than something he was subject to. She was on the 14th page when Elias came in. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and looked at her. He had the look of a man who had also not slept well and was not going to say so. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Like I have 43 things to say and 2 hours to say them in." "The hearing's scheduled for 10, he said. "We should leave by 8 to give you time before it starts." "I know." She turned a page. "Samuel sent a message last night." The kitchen went quiet. "I know," she said again before he could ask. "Ruth gave it to me. I read it." She paused. "He wants to testify. He says he has documentation the original agreement Crow made with him, which apparently includes language that makes clear Samuel understood the contract was coerced. Crow offered to forgive a debt Samuel owed on the property in exchange for the signature." She looked up. Samuel kept the paperwork. Elias set down his coffee cup. "That's significant, yes." She looked back at the ledger. "It means Crow's lawyer can't argue that Samuel acted in good faith. It means there's a paper trail showing Crow knew exactly what he was doing." A pause. "It also means my brother has to stand in that courtroom and say out loud what he did. Will he?" She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Samuel on the porch, hat in his hands, eyes red. She thought about the 2 years she'd carried that household, the accounts, the taxes, the deed renewal, while Samuel made small bad choices, and hoped she wouldn't notice. She thought about the blue shirt with the patched elbow. She thought about the fact that he had kept the paperwork. A guilty man who keeps the paperwork is a man who always knew on some level that there would be a reckoning. "Yes," she said. "I think he will." "Grace." He said her name the way he'd said it yesterday in the courthouse, not soft, not hard, just direct, like he meant for it to land. "Whatever he does today doesn't change what he did." "I know that. And it doesn't obligate you to." "I know that too." She closed the ledger. She looked at him. "I'm not forgiving him today. I'm using what he has because it helps the 43 women in this book. Those are different things." She picked up her coffee. "I'm clear on the difference." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee cup again. "Yes," he said quietly. "I reckon you are." They rode into town at 8. The summer heat was already serious, the kind that settled into your clothing and stayed there, and the valley shimmered at the edges, and the road was pale and hard-packed, and the whole world felt like it was waiting for something to crack open. The courthouse steps had people on them. More than Grace expected. Not a crowd exactly, but a gathering, the particular kind that forms when a town knows something important is happening and wants to be present at the edges of it. She recognized no one specifically, but she felt them looking. She felt them looking at the ledger under her arm, and the rope marks on her wrists, faded now to a dull yellow-green, and the size of her belly, and the way she walked up those steps, not hurrying, not performing, just moving with the particular deliberate focus of a woman who knows where she is going and why. Elias walked beside her. He did not touch her arm or guide her elbow or do any of the things men did when they were trying to manage a woman under the guise of helping. He simply walked beside her at her pace present. She noticed. Inside, the clerk met them with the slightly dazed energy of a man who had spent 2 days preparing for something and was only now realizing it was real. He showed them to a side room where Alderton's court officer, a solid woman named Mrs. Hayes, went through what would happen, the order of testimony, the format, what Grace could and could not speak to directly, what the judge would ask, and what he would not. Grace listened and asked 3 precise questions, and Mrs. Hayes answered them with visible relief, the way a person responds when they have been braced for difficulty and found competence instead. Samuel was in the hallway when Grace came out of the side room. She stopped. He looked worse than she'd expected. He had lost weight in 4 days, or maybe she was simply seeing him differently now. Seeing what had always been there, and choosing not to see before. He was holding the same hat, the same terrible hat, and when he saw her, his face did the thing it had done on the porch, the involuntary crumpling of a man who knows he has no right to ask for anything, but cannot stop himself from hoping. "Grace," he said. She looked at him. She let herself look at him fully without managing it for the first time since she'd turned away from that porch. "You have the agreement," she said. "Yes." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. She took it, opened it, read it in under a minute. The language was exactly what he'd described. Clear, specific, the debt forgiveness written in Crow's own hand, as the explicit consideration for Samuel's signature. A man who had written that language knew precisely what he was purchasing and why the ordinary market wouldn't provide it. She folded it and held it. "You're going to stand up and say all of it," she said. "The debt, the conversation with Crow, what you understood the contract meant, all of it." "Yes," he said. "And you're not going to look at me while you say it," she said. "You're going to look at the judge and say it because it's true, and because it matters not, because I'm in the room." He nodded. "Samuel." She waited until he looked at her directly. "I'm not doing this for you. I want you to understand that. I'm doing this because it helps the case, and because those women deserve every piece of evidence this court can get." She paused. "What happens between you and me is a different conversation. That conversation doesn't happen today." His jaw worked. His eyes went red again. He nodded. She walked past him into the courtroom. Silas Crow was already there. She had not seen him before. She had a name and a ledger and a methodology, but she had not had a face. The face was a surprise. She had expected something that looked like what he was, and instead he was simply a man in his 60s, well-dressed with white hair and the kind of soft, settled prosperity that comes from decades of accumulation. He sat at the respondent's table with his lawyer, a thin man in a gray suit, and he looked at Grace when she came in with an expression of almost professional blandness, as if she were a minor complication in an otherwise orderly day. That blandness made her angrier than cruelty would have. She filed the anger carefully and sat down. Alderton came in, and the room rose, and the hearing began. The first hour was Procedure Alderton laying out the scope of the inquiry, the lawyer in the gray suit making objections that Alderton noted, and set aside with the efficiency of a man who had already read the ledger twice and made up his mind about what he was looking at. Crow's lawyer argued jurisdiction. He argued chain of custody on the ledger. He argued that Grace's recovery of the document from a privately staged wagon constituted unlawful taking. Alderton let him finish. Then he said, "The wagon was staged on property belonging to the Boone Ranch without permission, which Mr. Boone will confirm. The ledger was in proximity to Miss Whitaker's person when she was transported against her will. Her recovery of it is consistent with the recovery of personal effects wrongfully taken. These objections are noted and overruled. We will proceed." The gray-suited lawyer sat down. He wrote something on his notepad. He did not look happy. Elias testified. First, the fence line, the wagon, the men on the property, the relay station, the geography of it. He testified with the same flat, unhurried precision he brought to everything. And when the gray-suited lawyer cross-examined him, Elias answered each question with exactly the information asked, and nothing more, which was the most effective form of testimony Grace had ever witnessed, because it gave the lawyer nothing to work with. Then Grace was called. She walked to the stand, and she sat down, and she put the ledger on the rail in front of her, and she looked at Judge Alderton, and she began. She read the names, all 43. She read them slowly and clearly. First name, last name, age, date of contract, because each name was a person, and each person deserved to be said out loud in a room where it had to be recorded. She heard the quality of the silence in that courtroom change as she read the particular weight that builds when a room full of people begins to understand the scale of something. She was on the 22nd name when Crow's lawyer stood up. "Your Honor, the witness is reading from a document whose authenticity..." I'm not reading, Grace said without raising her voice. Alderton looked at her. I have the ledger in front of me, she said, but I'm not reading from it. I have these names memorized. I can close the ledger and continue if that addresses the concern. She looked at the lawyer. Would that satisfy the objection? A beat of silence. Alderton said, Demonstrate. She closed the ledger. She continued from name 23 without pausing. She went through 23, 24, 25, each one, precise the dates and amounts and notations delivered in exact order. At 30, the lawyer sat back down. At 43, she stopped. The courtroom was very quiet. The notation system in the back section, Alderton said. Walk me through it. She did. She explained the debt, accounting the way the balances were calculated, the mechanism by which women who worked off their initial contract found the debt renewed. A new charge added a new service fee, a new amount owed that kept the contract active indefinitely. She explained the land parcel documentation and what the removal of the Hargrove deed had required a payment to a land office clerk named Gerald Pitts, documented in Crow's own hand. She set the original agreement Samuel had given her on the ledger rail. This is the instrument Crow used to obtain my brother's signature. The consideration offered was the forgiveness of a debt on the Whitaker property. The language makes clear that Crow understood Samuel did not have independent legal authority to bind me to a labor contract because the agreement includes a clause requiring Crow to manage any legal challenge arising from my objection. She looked at Alderton. He anticipated I would object. He built the management of my objection into the contract before he even sent his men. Alderton leaned forward. He planned for me specifically, Grace said, which means he knew exactly what the law said about my right to refuse, and he planned to circumvent it anyway. Crow's lawyer was on his feet. Your Honor, this is speculation. It's contract interpretation, Grace said, still in the same level voice. I've kept books and read legal documents for 9 years. That clause has one purpose and one reading. I'm happy to go through it line by line if the court requires. Alderton raised his hand slightly at the lawyer. The lawyer sat down. Again. Then Samuel was called. Grace watched him walk to the stand. She watched him sit. She watched him put his hands flat on his knees the way he'd always done when he was bracing for something difficult, a habit from childhood she recognized without warmth or nostalgia, simply as information. He testified for 40 minutes. He said all of it. The debt. The conversation with Crow in which Crow had made clear the debt would be called in if Samuel didn't cooperate. The way the contract had been presented as a work arrangement when Samuel knew he said it clearly without equivocation that he knew Grace had not been consulted and would not have agreed. He said I knew she wouldn't agree. He said I signed it anyway. He said I have no explanation for that I'm satisfied with. Crow's lawyer did not cross-examine Samuel extensively. Grace understood why Samuel's testimony was a confession, and trying to poke holes in a confession in front of a judge only made the confessor look more credible. When Samuel stepped down, he looked at Grace for a moment. She met his eyes. She did not nod, did not smile, did not offer anything. She simply looked at him the same way she'd looked at everything today, straight at it, without flinching and without performing. He looked away first. Crow's lawyer made his closing arguments. He argued insufficient evidence for the broader charges, argued that individual contracts were matters between private parties, argued that the land transactions had been conducted within the law, as it stood at the time. Alderton listened. Then he looked at his notes. Then he looked at the ledger on his desk. I'm prepared to rule on several matters today, he said, and to schedule formal proceedings on the criminal charges which will require territorial prosecution. He looked at Grace. Miss Whitaker, the contract bearing your name is void. Your deed stands. The Whitaker property is yours in full unencumbered by any instrument signed by Samuel Whitaker on or after the date of your deed renewal. A pause. The ledger is taken into territorial custody as evidence. The names in it will be preserved in the court record. Another pause. Mr. Crow, You are remanded pending the scheduling of formal charges. The amount of bond will be set at a figure that reflects the scope of what this court has heard today." He set the gavel down. The sound of it filled the room. Grace put both hands flat on the ledger rail and let herself breathe. Just breathe in through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she'd been breathing all morning, in the careful, controlled manner of a woman managing a great deal at once. She let the breath come all the way in and all the way out, and she felt Anna shift beneath her ribs, a slow and certain movement, and she pressed one hand there. In her peripheral vision, she saw Crow's lawyer bend toward Crow and speak rapidly. She saw Crow's face for the first time today lose its professional blandness just briefly, just a tightening around the eyes and mouth, the face of a man who has been operating at the edge of the law for so long that the arrival of consequence feels genuinely foreign. She looked away from him. She did not need to see it. She had not come here to watch him lose. She had come here for 43 names in a ledger, and those names were now on the record of this court, and no one was going to cross them out. Elias was at her side when she stood, not touching her, not guiding her, simply there. The same steadiness he'd brought to every moment of this day and the day before. She gathered the deed and the agreement, and she stood up straight, and she turned toward the door. Mrs. Hayes met her in the aisle with a look on her face that Grace recognized, the look of a woman who has seen the thing she hoped to see and is keeping her composure about it through significant effort. "Miss Whitaker," Mrs. Hayes said, "the court will need a formal statement regarding the 19 active contracts. When you're ready." "Tomorrow morning," Grace said. "I'll be here." She walked out of the courtroom and into the heat of the summer afternoon, and behind her the room began to find its voice again, and she did not look back at any of it. Not at Crow, not at Samuel, not at the gray-suited lawyer or the gallery or the ledger on the judge's desk. She walked forward into the light with her deed in her hand, and her daughter quiet beneath her ribs, and the certain settled knowledge that those 43 names were no longer crossed out. They were on the record. They were real, and they would not be erased again. Anna Hope Whitaker came into the world on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the hearing in the back bedroom of Ruth Bell's ranch house, with Ruth's steady hands and the particular relentless heat of a Montana August pressing through every wall. She came fast, the way she'd done everything, with urgency, with impatience, with a certainty that the world needed to get itself ready because she was arriving regardless. Grace had been awake since 2 in the morning, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with a cup of tea. She wasn't drinking, knowing the way a woman knows things about her own body, and when Ruth came in at 4 and looked at her face, she simply said, "All right then, let's get you to bed." 6 hours. That was all it took. 6 hours of the hardest work Grace had ever done, and she had done hard work her entire life, and none of it had prepared her for this particular combination of pain and purpose, and the animal absolute commitment of a body doing exactly what it was built to do. She made noise. She had not planned to make noise, had intended to manage it the way she managed everything, quietly and without display. But her body overruled her on that point completely, and Ruth said, "That's right. Go ahead and say so." And Grace said so. And then Anna was there. Ruth put her on Grace's chest before anything else, before the cleaning or the wrapping or the ordinary procedures of the world. And Grace looked down at this person, this complete, separate, furious person, who was already making her opinions known at the top of her lungs, and she felt something move through her that had no name she'd ever learned. Not relief, though it was partly that. Not love, though it was entirely that. Something older, something that felt like the deepest possible form of recognition. "Anna," Grace said. The baby stopped crying. Just for a moment, one brief, startled pause, as if the sound of her name was something she'd been waiting to hear. Then she started again, louder. Ruth laughed. It was the first time Grace had heard Ruth laugh fully, and it was a good sound. The laugh of a woman who had seen enough of the world's difficulty that she took its joys with genuine gratitude. "She knows her name," Ruth said. "Lord help everyone." Grace held her daughter and shook and did not cry, or did cry. She wasn't entirely sure. And outside the window, the August sun was coming up hard and gold over the valley, and the world was going about its ordinary business, and none of it knew or cared that something had just happened in this room that changed the shape of everything. Elias knocked on the door 2 hours later. He had been in the barn. Ruth told her had been there since 4 in the morning without being asked, doing the kind of work that needed doing, staying close without being in the way. Grace heard Ruth open the door, heard the low exchange of voices, heard Ruth say, "They're both fine. She's got her mother's jaw," and heard what might have been a breath released. She was sitting up in bed, Anna asleep against her chest when he came in. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and looked at Anna, and the expression on his face was not something she had seen there before. It was not the careful assessing look he brought to problems, not the steady watchfulness he'd brought to the courthouse and the relay station and every moment of the last 3 weeks. It was simpler than that. It was the face of a man looking at something that mattered to him and not having enough control over his own face to hide it. "She's beautiful," he said. "She's loud," Grace said. "She came out complaining, and I don't think she's planning to stop." "Sounds familiar," he said. Grace looked at him. Something in his expression shifted, that almost thing, the one that had been showing up at the edges of his face since the beginning, finally arriving fully. It was a smile, quiet and real, and directed entirely at her, not at the situation or the problem or the remarkable series of events that had brought them to this room. At her. She felt it land somewhere she hadn't expected. The formal proceedings against Silas Crowe had moved faster than anyone predicted, largely because the territorial prosecutor, once presented with the ledger and the court record from Alderton's hearing, had treated the case with the urgency it deserved. Gerald Pitts had broken within 48 hours of being contacted, had produced from a locked box under his desk at the land office 3 additional deed documents he'd been paid to remove and file away. 4 more families now had claims in process. The Hargroves had been to see Elias twice, and the second time Mr. Hargrove had sat at Ruth's kitchen table and put his face in his hands and shaken for a while, and nobody had said anything, because sometimes silence is the only honest response to a man learning that what he believed was lost might be returned. 7 of the 19 active contracts had been voided by territorial order within the first week. The remaining 12 were in process, complicated by the fact that in 4 cases, the women involved had no family to return to, no property, no documented prior life that the court could restore. Grace had submitted a formal statement to the territorial court. On that matter had argued in language. She chose carefully that the burden of establishing an alternative could not fall on women who had already been stripped of everything, and that the territory had an obligation to provide what it had failed to prevent. Alderton had sent her a note. It said, "Your statement is on the record. It will be heard." She kept the note. Samuel had not returned to the Whitaker property. He had sent a letter, long, thorough, the kind of letter a man writes when he is trying to say everything he should have said and knows the words are insufficient. Grace read it twice and put it in the cedar box where she kept important documents, and did not respond yet. Not because she wouldn't, because she was still deciding what she wanted to say, and she had learned in the last month to take her time with decisions that mattered. The Whitaker property needed work. That was the plain fact of it. 2 years of Samuel's management had left the fences in poor repair, the books in disorder, and the south pasture untended. Grace had ridden out there on the 4th day after the hearing, Anna not yet born, and her body still carrying the full weight of the last weeks, and she had walked the fence line and looked at the books and stood in the yard of the house where she had grown up and felt the particular grief of a place that has been neglected by someone who should have loved it better. She had also felt something else. The way a person feels when they look at a problem that is genuinely theirs to solve and finds underneath the difficulty of it something that functions very much like purpose. "I'll need help with the south pasture," she told Elias the morning after the hearing over Ruth's kitchen table, not asking, stating a fact about a situation that required resources she didn't currently have. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for charity." "I know that too. I can pay Grace." He set down his coffee cup. "I'm not talking about charity or payment. I'm talking about—" He paused. He was not a man who chose words carelessly, and she had learned that his pauses meant he was finding the right ones. I'm talking about 2 properties that share a fence line and a lot of work that could be done better by 2 sets of hands than one. A pause. I'm talking about a practical arrangement between neighbors. She looked at him. That's what you're calling it? That's what it is, he said. For now. For now. She heard the for now. She put it in the same place she'd been putting everything about Elias Boone for the past 2 weeks. The place where she kept things that were true and real and not yet fully named the place she would return to when the immediate emergencies had settled and she had the space to think carefully about what she actually wanted. He came to the Whitaker property every morning for the following 3 weeks, from before the hearing, through the week after, through the last heavy days of her pregnancy. He came and he worked fence posts, the south pasture, the account books that he was honest enough to admit he needed her to walk him through, and he stayed until the work that could be done that day was done, and then he left. He did not stay for dinner unless Ruth was there. He did not overstep in any direction. He was present, and he was useful, and he was... She had come to understand deeply, genuinely, careful with her, not in the way of a man managing a fragile thing, but in the way of a man who understood that a woman who had just had everything taken from her needed to recover the shape of her own life before anyone added their weight to it. That was the thing about Elias Boone that Grace had been turning over since the moment he'd crouched in the dry summer grass and cut the rope from her wrists. He consistently did the thing that was actually needed, rather than the thing that would make him feel useful. Those were different things, and most people in Grace's experience chose the latter. Now, in the early light of Anna's first morning in the world, he was sitting in the chair by the window while Grace held the baby, and Ruth moved quietly in the kitchen, making breakfast, and the house had the particular hushed quality of a space holding something new and trying not to disturb it. "What does she look like?" he asked. He was looking at his hands, giving Grace the privacy of his averted gaze, which she noted and appreciated. "Like herself," Grace said. "I don't know yet who she looks like. She looks like she has opinions." "I believe that." A pause. Anna stirred against her chest, made a small sound, settled again. "Elias," Grace said. He looked up. "I want to tell you something." She kept her voice steady, not because she was managing the emotion of it, but because she meant every word, and she wanted him to hear them clearly. "When you cut that rope, you didn't ask why I needed it cut. You looked at the situation, and you saw what was needed, and you did it." She paused. "I have been thinking about that every day since, about what it means to be helped without being managed, about what it means when someone looks at you and sees what's actually there instead of what they want to be there." He was very still. "I don't know what the practical arrangement between neighbors looks like in a year," she said. "I don't know what it looks like in 5 years. I'm not asking you to tell me, I'm just..." She stopped. She looked down at Anna, at the small sleeping weight of her, at the particular perfection of her daughter's face at rest. "I'm just telling you that I see what you are, and I'm grateful for it, and that I intend to be someone worth the seeing." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind that comes when something true has been said in a room and the room is holding it. "Grace," Elias said. His voice was rougher than usual. "You have been worth the seeing since you walked out of that brush with rope on your wrists and blood on your arm and asked me if it was my land before you said anything else." A pause. "That's not something you have to earn." She looked at him. He looked back. Outside, the morning was continuing its work, the heat building the valley going gold, the ordinary machinery of the world proceeding without sentiment. The fences on the south pasture needed finishing. The account books needed another week of work. There were 12 women still in process with the territorial court, and a formal statement Grace intended to follow up on until someone in the capital gave her a direct answer. There was a great deal still to do. There always was. She understood now that this was not a burden, but the shape of a life that was actually hers fully and irreversibly, hers not held in someone else's hand, or contracted away, or crossed through with a single line. Anna opened her eyes. They were dark and unfocused and utterly alert, the eyes of a person arriving in a world she had not seen yet and already paying close attention. "There you are," Grace said. The baby looked at her. The baby Grace was certain of it looked directly at her, with the particular gravity of someone who has just arrived somewhere important, and wants to be sure the right person is holding them. "I've got you," Grace said. "I'm not going anywhere." She meant it the way she meant everything, completely without qualification, with the full weight of a woman who had learned the hard way that words either meant what they said or they meant nothing. And she had decided somewhere on a summer road with her wrists bound and her daughter kicking beneath her ribs that every word she said for the rest of her life was going to mean exactly what it said. Anna Hope Whitaker. One day old looked at her mother and made a sound like agreement. Ruth appeared in the doorway with a plate of food and the expression of a woman who had seen enough hard things to know a good one when it was standing right in front of her. Elias stood and moved toward the door to give Grace space to eat. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at her one more time. Just one look, the steady, honest look that had become as familiar to her as the weight of her own name, and then he went out. Grace held her daughter. She ate Ruth's biscuits. The sun came fully up over the valley. The Whitaker property had a deed with her name on it. A south pasture being repaired by steady hands, and in the cedar box on the kitchen table beside a territorial court notice, and a judge's note, and a letter she would answer when she was ready. There were 43 names written in a ledger that now lived in the permanent record of this territory, where they would remain long after every man who had tried to erase them was gone. Grace Whitaker had come into this summer with her wrists bound and her future contracted away by a man who believed that her silence was the same thing as her consent. She had left that summer with her daughter in her arms, her land under her feet, her name on the record, and the absolute unassailable certainty that no one, not now, not ever again, would make that mistake twice.